This week, I'll be discussing LibGuides and we'll be reading about best practices and some case studies of LibGuides in the library. In this lecture, I want to define the LibGuide, look at best practices for creating LibGuides, and locate some tools and examples of LibGuides. So what's a LibGuide? LibGuides are a content management system that allows creators to incorporate dynamic tools such as blogs, wikis, chat widgets, RSS feeds, embedded video, and more into your web page in order to connect users and patrons with shared content on specific subjects. A LibGuide is a way for the librarian to reach their users in a dynamic visual platform that specifically focuses in on one subject. So, some strengths of LibGuides. The LibGuides can engage many Web 2.0 tools, such as photos, chat widgets, embedded videos, and RSS feeds. So, as tools develop online, a LibGuide can plug those tools in and engage the specific topic and the librarian to the user with these various electronic digital tools. The SpringShare LibGuide, which you will be using in class, is easy, affordable, and flexible. So it's commonly used among librarians because of these sort of strengths. Another strength of the LibGuide is that it can be used as a library's home web page. So a library may also use this SpringShare account as their main web page, and they can make it a very dynamic page with these easy to use plugins and essentially boxes that create the LibGuide. The SpringShare LibGuide and many other LibGuide platforms are also easily accessible and easy to build, so a novice at building web pages will find their SpringShare accounts easy to create their own LibGuide. Another strength of the LibGuide is that it gives a digital map and access to collections. So many libraries now have these digital collections and many items are digitized, and the LibGuide is another way to bring a patron to those items. And finally, a LibGuide ultimately functions as a secondary level of support for students' research assignments. This is within the academic library context. So what researchers have found is that first and foremost, students do very well, of course, with the support of their librarian and something like a reference interview. But the LibGuide adds to a reference interview or an instructional course in the library. It gives more support to students working on their research. Now, there are weaknesses to the LibGuide as well. One major weakness is that researchers have found that there can be a disconnect between the librarian's desire to create subject guides and a low usage of these guides. Researchers also found that there was a large number of respondents in the library who actually, in surveys about a LibGuide, did not find LibGuides helpful. When researchers surveyed patrons, they found that the LibGuide had a very low usage if that LibGuide was hidden on the library's main website. So really there needed to be an visual direction to that LibGuide on the first page of the library website. Research has also found that LibGuides cannot replace library instruction. So we go back to this as a strength that LibGuides ultimately act as a secondary reference, especially for students conducting research, high school or college students. Um, so students who receive library instruction in person or online tended to make more use of subject guides. And finally, a LibGuide with dead links or aspects of the LibGuide that seem non-active can actually discredit librarians or libraries to their patrons. Some best practices from LibGuides for your LibGuide. First is the suggestion to use minimal text. Um, so rather than writing a large block text, use lists because this is how readers on website and essentially readers of digital information read contemporarily. They tend to read and absorb in lists. So use lists instead of large blocks. Avoid the term click here and then adding a URL after, rather make your link visible on the text. Use emphasis sparingly, so bolding or italics or underline, use that sparingly. And finally, get to the point. Research has found that librarians or content creators have 3 seconds to get their readers' attention. Some more best practices, and you'll read more about these on these various LibGuides, best practices, resources. Know your audience. So who are your users? Which patrons or users are you seeking to provide content to? And what kind of tools may help them to shape the guide for their information needs and interests? Communicate. You should share your policies of how you created the LibGuide, your style guides, and reusable content with your colleagues so that when you are all, if you're in a library setting and you're all creating LibGuides, there's some form of symmetry there. Use the buddy system. Have a peer or a colleague read through your guide before publishing to look for any spelling errors. Avoid welcome messages. So your first page should not have a welcome message, but you can use bulleted lists instead. This is just the nature of online readership, is that bulk text, such as a welcome message, will not grab a reader's attention. Front load your content. Add the most important information first in your LibGuide. And you want to use plain language. So avoid things like jargon. Use as plain language as you can. Avoid a passive voice and hidden verbs. Link text should provide information when read out of context. Avoid cap locks, because as we know, that seems like shouting to a reader. Eliminate unnecessary words. And avoid third-person terms. So for an example, instead of saying this guide is for the patron, this guide is for you. You're basically speaking directly to the user through your LibGuide. Some examples of some great LibGuides out there, and try to look through great LibGuides as you're designing your own LibGuide to get a visual example. The Newport News Public Library. The Newport News Public e-Library, you can see that as you come to the first page, there isn't necessarily a welcome message with bulk text. Right here, you immediately have bullet lists, and this is probably because this LibGuide and this library knows their users, so they know what their users are looking for. They're looking for careers. They immediately have their contact information in the within your first site. They have the most important information within the top of the page, front loaded. the Lane Community College Art and Art History LibGuide. Now, this actually does have a welcome message, and immediately it tells the users what the guide is for. It says this guide is intended to help you, so you're talking directly to your user. But here you do have very small amount of text and lists, and this is just how readers of digital resources read, so you'll have to keep that in mind as you develop your own LibGuide. And finally, we have the North Scituate Elementary School Library LibGuide. Here, this LibGuide is very visual, so obviously it's for young adult users, and so we have a lot of visual going on here, but they've front-loaded the information for what students want. There's not even a welcome message. There's a cartoon or a comic. So some useful links and tools. There's Working Inside the Box, LibGuide tips for librarians. So here I'm not following best practices. I do have a link out, but I wanted you to be able to see that if you needed to get to this tool. So if you go to best practices, Working Inside the Box, LibGuide tips for librarians, you'll find a lot of this information as well. And what you'll really find is a detailed guide to some of the points that I've covered here. From SpringShare, SpringShare has a number of useful links and tools. They have LibGuides Volume 1 and 2, Help and Documentation. The Best of LibGuides community, click through some of those links to get to know the Best of LibGuides. And the Boston College Libraries as well has a wonderful publishing checklist. So you can look through that publishing checklist and see if you've followed best of practices. So in this lecture, I defined what a LibGuide was. I discussed some best practices for creating LibGuides, including some strengths and weaknesses that we see from general use of LibGuides. And finally, we looked at some tools and examples of LibGuides.